A man looked her up and down and burst out laughing, right in the middle of the crowd. "You think you're the bride?" he said. "I called the wrong person." Abigail Turner stood on the snow-covered platform, her only suitcase, penniless, with no one to meet her and nowhere to go. She had traveled thousands of miles for an advertisement promising a new life. Instead, she received humiliation in front of the entire town. If it were you, what would you do? Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next heartwarming story. And now let me tell you what really happened to Abigail Turner. The man laughed before she even stepped off the train. That was the part Abigail Turner would remember longest. Not the cold, not the stares, not even what he said after. It was the laugh that came first. Loud, unguarded, the kind of laugh a person makes when they've seen something so ridiculous they can't help themselves. She was still on the metal steps of the rail car, one hand gripping the railing, her worn leather bag clutched to her chest, when the sound split the air and every head on the platform turned to find its source. They found her instead. She was 24 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she weighed more than most people thought a woman her age ought to weigh. She had known that her whole life. She had worn it the way some people wore a scar, always there, always visible, shaping how strangers looked at her before she had opened her mouth or done a single thing to deserve their judgment. In the town of Harlow Creek, Wyoming Territory, on the second Tuesday of February in 1883, that judgment arrived faster than it ever had before. The man standing at the base of the steps was named Roy Casper. She didn't know his name yet, she only knew his face. Florid, broad-jawed, wearing a sheepskin coat with a damp collar. And she knew the way his mouth had opened when he saw her, and the sound that had come out of it. He was maybe 40, maybe older, with the particular kind of self-satisfaction that belongs to men who have never once been laughed at themselves. "Lord Almighty," Roy said, and he turned to the man beside him. "You see this?" The man beside him saw it. So did the woman in the gray wool coat near the station door. So did the porter unloading freight 20 feet away, who paused with a crate in his arms and looked over his shoulder. So did the 2 boys loitering by the water trough, who were at an age where cruelty feels like entertainment, and they hadn't yet learned, or perhaps didn't care, that there was a difference. Abigail came down the last 2 steps and stood on the platform boards. Her feet hurt. They had hurt since Kansas City, where she'd sat too long in a seat too narrow, and the circulation had gone strange in her ankles. She straightened her back. She had practiced this, the straightening, the refusal to fold. "I'm looking for Mr. Nathan Brooks," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "He sent for me from this address." She held up the letter. The envelope was worn soft at the folds from being handled so many times. Roy Casper looked at the envelope. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the man beside him, and whatever passed between them wasn't language exactly. It was something older and meaner than language. "Nathan Brooks sent for you," Roy said, and he wasn't asking. "Yes." "As a bride." She didn't answer that one. She didn't have to. They both knew what the advertisement had said. Roy tilted his head and let out a breath that turned to vapor in the cold air. "Well, sweetheart, I don't know what Nathan wrote in that letter, but I can promise you one thing." He looked her over again, slowly, the way a man examines livestock he's decided isn't worth buying. "He ain't here, and if he was, he'd have turned around and climbed back on that train before you even got both feet on the ground." Someone behind her laughed. She didn't turn to see who. The cold was remarkable. She had grown up in Ohio, had known cold, but this was different. It was a living thing here, pressing through her coat and her wool dress and the thin cotton beneath. The sky overhead was the color of old pewter, low and flat, and the wind moved across the platform in long, unbroken waves that found every gap in her clothing. She had 43 cents. That was the sum total of what she had left after the train fare and the single meal she'd allowed herself since Cincinnati. 43 cents, one bag containing 2 dresses, a hairbrush, her mother's thimble, and a Bible she hadn't opened since the funeral, and now a platform full of strangers who had already decided who she was. She walked past Roy Casper without looking at him again. The station agent was a small, dry man behind a barred window who listened to her ask about Nathan Brooks with the expression of someone enduring a minor inconvenience. "Brooks," he repeated, "has a place about 9 miles northeast. Hasn't been in town for a stretch." "How long a stretch?" The agent considered this with great apparent effort. 3 weeks? Maybe 4. "Is there a boarding house? A hotel?" "There's the Mercantile Hotel on Front Street. $1 a night." He paused. "In advance." She looked at the coins in her hand. "Is there anything—" She stopped. The word she was reaching for was cheaper, and she didn't want to say it in front of the 2 boys who had followed her inside and were now standing just close enough to overhear. "There is not," the agent said, and went back to his ledger. She stood in the station for a while after that, not because she had anywhere to go, but because the moment she walked back through those doors, she would have to decide something, and she wasn't ready yet. Her mother had died in September. Her father had died the January before that. The house had gone to debts she hadn't known existed until the lawyer showed up with papers and a face designed to express sympathy without actually feeling any. She had answered the advertisement in October, partly because a woman alone in Ohio in 1882 had very few options, and partly, this was the part she didn't like to admit, because she had believed it. She had believed that someone wanted her. The advertisement had been careful, professional. It had described a working rancher in good standing, widower, seeking a capable woman of good character to share a home in the Wyoming territory. Nothing in the advertisement mentioned beauty or size or the way a person looked standing on a train platform. She had written Nathan Brooks 4 letters. He had written her 3. His handwriting was bad, cramped and slanting, like a man writing in a hurry. But the words had been plain and decent. He had described his ranch. He had described the work. He had not promised her romance or happiness. He had promised her a fair arrangement, and she had found somehow that a fair arrangement was more than she'd gotten from most people. She folded the envelope back into her bag. Outside, the temperature had dropped another degree or 2. Front Street stretched ahead of her. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with its door propped open despite the cold, a small church, and a handful of other buildings she couldn't yet identify. There were maybe a dozen people visible, and 3 of them were watching her. She walked toward the general store because it was the closest thing, and she needed a moment out of the wind. The woman behind the counter was somewhere in her 50s, with the kind of face that had once been pretty and was now something better, capable and self-possessed and not easily impressed. She looked at Abigail without the laughter, which was already a significant improvement over Roy Casper. "You came in on the noon train," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "You're the one Nathan Brooks sent for." "Word travels fast." "It's February," the woman said, as if this explained everything, and perhaps in a town this small in the coldest month of the year it did. "I'm Dora Finch. I own this store with my husband." "Abigail Turner." Dora Finch studied her with more attention than rudeness, the way someone looks at a problem they're deciding whether to get involved in. "You know Nathan isn't in town. The station agent told me. He went up to check on his north fence line before the last big snow. That was—" She pulled in a slow breath. "That was longer ago than it should have been." Something shifted in the room. Not much, but enough. "What does that mean?" Abigail asked. "It means we don't know where he is." Dora set her hands flat on the counter. "It means we don't know much of anything. A man went out to his own property 3 weeks ago and hasn't come back, and this time of year that's either nothing or it's very much something." Abigail stood with this for a moment. She thought about the letter. She thought about the 43 cents. "He might be fine," Dora said, which is what people say when they're not sure. "He might be," Abigail agreed. Dora looked at her hands, then back at Abigail. "You have a place to stay tonight?" "I was going to look into the hotel. The hotel is $1 a night, and Frank Mercer runs it, and Frank is a man who will be perfectly polite to your face and then tell the whole town about your business before supper." Dora said this without inflection, as simple fact. "I have a room in the back. It's small and the stovepipe makes a racket, but it doesn't cost $1. Abigail looked at her. "You don't know me." "I know you came a long way, and your intended hasn't showed up, and Roy Casper made a spectacle of you in front of half the town, Dora said. That's enough for one day. You can decide how you feel about me after you've slept. She wasn't kind about it. She wasn't warm. She said it the way you hand someone a tool because they need it, not because you're particularly fond of them. And Abigail, who had spent the last few months being handled with either cruelty or excessive sympathy, found that the straightforwardness of it was almost a relief. Thank you, she said. Come on then, I'll show you where things are. The room in the back was small, as promised, with a single cot and a chest with a cracked hinge and a window that looked out onto an alley where someone had stacked empty crates. The stovepipe ran through the corner and did indeed make a racket, a persistent metallic ticking that went on no matter how the fire behaved. But it was warm. After the train, after the platform, after Roy Casper's laugh following her down the length of the street, warm was enough. Abigail sat on the edge of the cot and let herself breathe. She was not a woman given to self-pity, or at least she tried not to be. She had cried at her father's grave and again at her mother's, and she had allowed herself one bad night in Cincinnati when the reality of what she'd done, answered an advertisement, packed everything she owned, committed herself to a stranger in a territory she'd never visited, had arrived fully formed at 2 a.m. and sat on her chest until dawn. After that she had gotten up, washed her face, and decided that the situation was what it was and she would deal with it as it came. The situation was currently this. The man who'd sent for her was missing. She had 43 cents, a borrowed room, and a town full of people who had already made up their minds about her. She unpacked her bag carefully, setting things in the chest. The dresses, the hairbrush, her mother's thimble, small and silver, worn smooth on the inner rim. She held the thimble for a moment longer than necessary, then set it on the corner of the chest where she could see it. Then she lay down on the cot and stared at the ceiling and listened to the stovepipe tick. She thought about Nathan Brooks, the cramped handwriting, the plain words, the fact that he had said capable and not pretty and not young. She thought about what Dora Finch's face had looked like when she said we don't know where he is. She thought about her options, which were few enough that she could count them fast. She could go back to Ohio. She had no train fare for this. She could find work in Harlow Creek. She could see what Dora knew about getting word to the Brooks Ranch. She could wait and hope that a man who'd gone out to check a fence line 3 weeks ago in February would eventually come back. These thoughts were still moving through her head when she fell asleep, which happened faster than she expected and without her permission. She woke at dawn to the sound of voices in the store. Not quiet voices. The kind that don't care if they're heard. Can't stay here, Dora. Town doesn't need a charity case. Town doesn't need Roy Casper telling it what it needs either, but here we are. A pause. People are talking. People are always talking. It's winter, Roy. There's nothing else to do. She's not Nathan's problem if Nathan's not here, and she's sure as hell not yours. She's a woman alone in February with no money and nowhere to go. That makes her everyone's problem, whether you like it or not. Another pause, longer this time. Nathan's dead. Roy said it flat. No ceremony. You know it, and I know it. Went out in that weather, hasn't come back. Man's dead. And whatever arrangement he made with some fat girl from Ohio died with him. The word landed in the small room like something dropped on stone. Abigail lay still on the cot. She had stopped breathing without deciding to. You need to get her on the next train east, Roy said. Give her the fare if you have to, but get her out. And if I don't? Dora's voice was quiet in that specific way that isn't quiet at all. Then she becomes a problem, Roy said. And problems in this town have a way of getting solved whether people want them to or not. The door opened. Cold air came through the wall. Then the door shut again, and there was silence. Abigail sat up on the cot. She sat there for a while with her hands in her lap, listening to the stovepipe tick and the wind move against the building and the sound of Dora moving around in the store. And she thought very carefully about what Roy Casper had just said and what it meant. She thought about the word he'd used. She thought about the fact that she had 43 cents and a mother's thimble and a Bible she hadn't opened since September. And she thought about the long list of things that had already been taken from her and the much shorter list of things that had not. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, and opened the door. Dora was behind the counter with a broom, working at the floor with more force than the floor strictly required. I heard, Abigail said. Dora didn't stop sweeping. I know. He's not entirely wrong about the situation. He's wrong about enough of it. Abigail came to the counter. Tell me about the ranch, the Brooks place. What's out there? Dora looked up finally. Her expression was guarded. Why? Because if Nathan Brooks is missing and nobody's gone to look for him, I want to know why. It's 9 miles in snow that's been coming down hard for 3 weeks. I know. Tell me about the ranch. Dora studied her for a moment. Then she set the broom against the wall and folded her arms. You're not thinking about going out there yourself. Abigail didn't answer. You are, Dora said, and something changed in her face. Not admiration exactly, but something adjacent to it and complicated. You are actually thinking that. Someone should. You don't know this country. You've been here 12 hours. You don't know the roads. You don't know the weather patterns. You don't know what a whiteout looks like before it hits you, but then tell me. Dora opened her mouth and closed it again. She looked at Abigail with an expression that was difficult to read, like she was measuring something and wasn't yet sure of the result. Sit down, she said finally. I'll make coffee. She made it strong and black, and she pulled a chair around from her side of the counter so they were sitting across from each other at a small table near the stove, and she talked. About the ranch, 9 miles northeast on a road that stopped being a road about 4 miles out and became a series of markers if you knew where to look, which Abigail did not. About the weather, 2 more storms coming, the second one worse than anything they'd seen in 5 years. Every trapper and cattle hand who knew the territory said so. About Nathan Brooks, widower, had been in Harlow Creek 4 years, kept mostly to himself, didn't drink to excess, paid his debts, wasn't generally liked because he wasn't easy to like, but was generally respected because he didn't make himself someone else's problem. He's 41, Dora said. Came out here from somewhere back east. Doesn't talk about it. Lost his wife to a fever 2 years in. No children. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He wrote to one of those correspondence agencies for a bride. I know because he asked me if I thought it was foolish, and I told him it wasn't, and he said he didn't know what kind of woman would answer an advertisement like that. And I told him probably a woman with good sense and not enough options. Abigail looked at her coffee. He didn't know you were coming on the noon train, Dora said. The letter was delayed. I found out yesterday. It went to the wrong postal station in Cheyenne and sat there for 2 weeks before they forwarded it. He left for the fence line before it arrived. She paused. He never knew you were coming. He wasn't standing you up. This information settled somewhere in Abigail's chest. She wasn't sure yet what to do with it. You said there are markers, she said, on the road to his ranch. What kind of markers? Dora gave her a long look. Abigail. What kind? Tall posts, painted red at the top, every quarter mile or so, but after the second storm, half of them are buried. She set her cup down. This is a thing you shouldn't do. I know. It could kill you. I know that too. Then why? Because nobody else is going to. Abigail said it without heat, without drama. She said it the same way Dora had offered her the room the night before. A simple fact, acknowledged and moved past. Roy Casper has already decided Nathan is dead, and the situation is resolved. Nobody else is going out there, and I didn't come 1,200 miles to sit on a cot and wait to be sent home. Dora was quiet for a long moment. I can give you a coat, she said finally. My husband's old one, and I have snowshoes in the back. I don't know how to use snowshoes. You'll learn. The first mile is the worst. She stood. You'll need food. I have hardtack and dried meat, and I have a compass, which will do you some good if the markers are buried. Abigail looked at her. You're helping me. I'm giving you things, Dora said. There's a difference. What you do with them is your own business. She brought the coat from the back room. It was heavy canvas lined with wool, enormous on Dora's husband, who had been a large man, and on Abigail it fit differently, but it fit. The snowshoes were old, one of the leather bindings cracked and retied with a piece of rawhide. Dora showed her how to strap them on. She was patient about it, which meant she only said each thing twice. She packed food in a cloth sack. She found a wool scarf and a pair of men's gloves that were too big, but better than nothing. She got the compass from a drawer and checked that it still worked. The road goes northeast, she said. You keep northeast and you watch for the red markers. If you see the markers, you're right. If you stop seeing them, you stop moving and you figure out where you went wrong before you go further. You understand? Yes. If the sky starts going gray and the wind picks up from the west, you stop and you find shelter. Whatever's near you, you don't keep moving in a whiteout. All right. If you find him, Dora paused. If you find him, and he's hurt, you send up a signal. I have a man, Tom Gale, who checks in from that direction every few days. He'll see smoke. And if I don't find him, Dora looked at her steadily, then you come back here, and we figure out what comes next. They stood in the back room with the stovepipe ticking above them and the wind working at the corners of the building, and Abigail thought about Ohio and the empty house and the lawyer with his papers, and she thought about Roy Casper's laugh on the platform, and she thought about the cramped handwriting in 3 letters that had treated her like a capable person rather than an inconvenience. If Roy Casper asks where I went, she said, I'll tell him you took the train east, Dora said, and I'll do it with a straight face. She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. She went out through the back. The cold hit her like a door swinging open. She adjusted the canvas coat and checked the compass and looked northeast toward the flat white line of the horizon, where the land rose into hills she could barely distinguish from the sky. The snowshoes were awkward at first. She had to think about each step, planting them flat, lifting from the hip, keeping her weight balanced. By the time she reached the edge of town, she had the beginning of a rhythm, ungainly but functional, and she thought, good enough. Good enough was a long way from nothing. She found the first red marker 20 minutes out, barely visible above the snow line, its painted tip gone dull with ice. She filed its position in her mind and kept moving. Behind her, Harlow Creek shrank into a smudge of rooftops against the sky. She did not look back at it again. The silence out here was of a different kind than any she had known. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something immense and indifferent that had been here long before the railroads and would be here long after the last postmarker rotted out of the ground. She moved through it one careful step at a time, and she was afraid, genuinely and honestly afraid, in a way that lived in her stomach and made her hands grip the compass too hard. But she was also something else. Underneath the fear, or maybe alongside it, running in a parallel track, she was clear. She had not felt clear in a long time. She found the second marker, then the third. The fourth was buried, and she spent 10 minutes searching in a widening circle before she spotted the tip of it 4 feet to her left, and the relief was sharp enough to make her legs shake. She stood still until they stopped shaking. Then she adjusted her direction and kept on. The sky above her was the same flat pewter gray it had been all morning, neither better nor worse, holding its weather in reserve. She walked. By noon she had covered what she guessed was 5 or 6 miles, and her feet had gone from cold to aching to something past aching that she decided not to think about too directly. Her breathing was loud in her own ears. Sweat had gathered at her collar and cooled there, and she knew she needed to keep moving because stopping meant the cold would find it. She found the 5th marker and the 6th. She found the 7th just as the wind shifted, a long, slow change in direction, swinging from the north to the west, and with it a different texture in the air that she didn't have a word for yet, but her body recognized before her mind did. The light flattened. The horizon went uncertain. She stopped. She looked at the sky, which had gone from pewter to something the color of a bruise at the edges. Then she looked ahead, where the land crested slightly, and she thought she saw, she wasn't sure, something that broke the surface line that wasn't a postmarker and wasn't a tree. She went toward it. It was a fence, post and rail, mostly buried, but the top rail was still above the snow, running in a line that went east to west before curving north. And at the curve, maybe 200 yards ahead, there was a structure, low, dark, with a roof line that her eyes had trouble sorting from the surrounding gray. She went toward the structure. It was a barn. The door was on the south side, half open, one hinge pulled loose from the frame. She pushed it further and stepped inside and stood in the dimness while her eyes adjusted, and she smelled hay and animal and something else, something that was either smoke or the memory of smoke. And she heard, after a moment, the unmistakable sound of a horse breathing in the dark. "Hello?" she said. Her voice came out strange, scraped by the cold. Nothing human answered. She found the horse in the second stall, a dun gelding with one ear forward, watching her with the calm suspicion of an animal that has been alone long enough to make its own peace with the situation. He was standing. There was hay. Someone had put hay down. Not recently, but within the last day or two. She could tell by the way it had settled. Someone had been here. She turned around. The barn had a ladder at the back going up to the loft. She crossed to it and looked up, and in the darkness above she could see a shape that did not belong to the shape of hay. "Nathan Brooks," she said. A pause. Then, from above, a sound that was partway between a cough and a word. She climbed the ladder. He was in the corner of the loft, buried under a horse blanket in what appeared to be his own coat, and when she got close enough she could see his face, drawn and pale, and crusted with cold in a way that meant he had been here longer than one night. His eyes were open. He looked at her for a long moment with the unfocused attention of someone operating at the very edge of their resources. And then he said, in a voice that was barely a voice at all, "Who are you?" She sat down in the hay beside him. Her legs ached from the snowshoes and her feet were past feeling, and the wind outside had picked up to the low moan that Dora had warned her about. And she thought about the 7 miles back to Harlow Creek and the compass in her pocket and the dried meat in her bag. "My name is Abigail Turner," she said. "I'm the woman you sent for. You missed the train." He stared at her. "I know," she said. "I'll explain later. First, tell me what's wrong with you." He closed his eyes, opened them again. "Leg," he said. "Horse went down on the ice 3 days ago, maybe 4. I couldn't—" He stopped. "Can you walk?" A long pause. "No." She looked around the loft. Outside, the wind went from moan to something louder. She looked at the small ventilation gap in the barn wall and what she could see of the sky through it, and she thought very carefully, and she reached into her bag and found the dried meat and broke off a piece and held it out to him. "Eat this," she said. He looked at the meat. He looked at her. His expression was the particular expression of a man who has been alone for 4 days in a barn loft with a broken leg and no food and has just been handed dried meat by a complete stranger and does not have the resources left to decide how to feel about it. He took the meat. She broke off a piece for herself and ate it and looked at the ventilation gap and listened to the wind. "We're going to have to wait out whatever's coming," she said. "Then I'm going to get you home." She said it the way she said most things, not as a promise, exactly, but as a fact that had not yet happened, but was going to. He chewed slowly, swallowed. "The horse is all right," he said, and she understood that this mattered to him. "I saw him. He's fine." He nodded, and some of the tension went out of his face. The wind hit the barn wall and the whole structure shuddered around them, and the dun gelding in the stall below shifted his weight and huffed once and went still again. Abigail pulled her coat tighter and settled her back against the hay wall and took out the compass and looked at it and put it away. 9 miles back to Harlow Creek. A man who couldn't walk. A storm coming in from the west. She thought about Roy Casper saying problems in this town have a way of getting solved. She thought about what the word solved had meant when he said it, and the ease with which he'd meant it, and the 43 cents in her pocket, and the feel of the snowshoes on her feet for 7 miles through snow so deep the posts were buried. Then she stopped thinking about Roy Casper, because he wasn't here and she was, and the situation was what it was, and she would deal with it as it came. That was all she knew how to do. That was, it turned out, enough. The storm hit the barn like it had been waiting. It came in from the west the way Dora had described, the wind first, changing character from a moan to something more deliberate, and then the snow driving sideways through every crack and gap in the boards, until the air inside the loft was no longer quite still. The temperature dropped fast. Abigail could feel it in her face first, then in her hands, then in a deep settling cold that worked its way through the canvas coat and the wool beneath and made itself at home in her bones. Nathan had fallen into something between sleep and unconsciousness within an hour of her arriving, which she took as a sign that his body had decided she was not an immediate threat and had directed its remaining resources elsewhere. She checked his leg without waking him, felt along the length of it through his trousers, careful, systematic, the way her mother had taught her to handle anything that might hurt, which was slowly and without flinching. The break was in the lower leg, below the knee. The bone hadn't come through the skin, which was the best news she'd had all day. But the leg was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and when she pressed gently near the worst of it, he made a sound in his sleep that she did not like. She did not have anything useful to do about a broken leg in a barn loft in a blizzard. She knew that, so she covered him back up with the horse blanket and his coat and sat with her back against the hay wall and listened to the storm take the world apart outside. The gelding below moved in his stall. She could hear him, the shift of his hooves on the packed earth, the occasional soft exhale. At some point during the night, she climbed down and checked on him, partly because Nathan had cared about the horse, and partly because she needed something to do with her hands. She found a half-full bucket of water that had started to ice over at the edges and broke the crust with her knuckle and let him drink. And she found the remainder of the hay and spread some in the stall, and she stood with her hand on his neck for a while in the dark, because the animal's warmth was real and present, and the storm outside was neither of those things. She went back up the ladder. She did not sleep. She ate another piece of dried meat and drank from her canteen and sat in the dark with the compass in her hand, though there was nothing useful the compass could tell her right now, and she counted the sounds of the storm and waited. Nathan woke near dawn. She knew it was near dawn because the light at the ventilation gap had shifted from black to the particular gray that comes before color. "You're still here," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought I dreamed you." "You didn't." He shifted, trying to push himself upright, and the sound he made when the leg moved was short and involuntary and honest, the kind of sound a person doesn't choose to make. "Don't," she said. "I need to—" "What you need to do," she said, "is stay still and tell me how bad the pain is." He let his head fall back. He breathed. "Bad enough," he said. "On a scale." He looked at the ceiling of the loft. 7, maybe 8 this morning. It was worse 2 days ago. "That's the swelling. It'll be worse again before it's better." He turned his head to look at her. Even in the poor light, she could see him trying to get his bearings, placing her, placing himself, working out the logic of her presence in the way an exhausted man works out arithmetic, slowly and with visible effort. "The letter," he said. "You said I missed the train." "Your letter was delayed in Cheyenne. You left before it arrived. You didn't know I was coming." He absorbed this. "How did you know to come here?" "Dora Finch told me where the ranch was." "Dora." Something moved in his face. "She helped you. She gave me a coat and snowshoes and dried meat and a compass and didn't charge me for any of it." He was quiet again. Outside, the storm had pulled back somewhat, still loud but no longer the sustained assault of the night before. She thought the worst of it had passed, though she had no real way to know. "How many days were you out here before I came?" she asked. 4, maybe 5. I lost track of the 3rd day. He said it without self-pity, just inventory. The horse went down on a patch of ice on the north side of the fence line. I went over with him. He got up. I didn't. He paused. I managed to get myself back to the barn. Took most of a day. She looked at him. The distance from the north fence line to the barn. She didn't know it, but she knew what it meant to move with a broken leg in deep snow. And the fact that he had done it and was still here to tell her about it was a kind of information she filed away without comment. "You've been alone 4 days with a broken leg," she said. 5, maybe. "And you fed the horse." He needed feeding. She looked at the canvas coat in her lap. She looked at the compass. She thought about Roy Casper standing at the base of the train steps and laughing, and she thought about what he'd said in the store, "Man's dead," and what it meant that Nathan Brooks was not dead, but was alive in a barn loft because he'd gotten himself there on a broken leg, 1 hand and 2 feet, and sheer stubbornness through 5 feet of snow. "The storm's letting up," she said. "When it does, I need to get you back to town." 9 miles. "I'm aware." "I can't walk." "I know." She didn't say what she was thinking yet, which was that she had looked at the gelding the night before and thought about it some more, and she had some ideas about what was possible and what wasn't. Nathan turned his head again. She could feel him looking at her in the gray light with the specific attention of a man who is revising something. "What did they tell you?" he said. "In town, when you got off the train. They told me you were probably dead and I should get on the next train east." Roy Casper. He made his opinion known. Nathan was quiet for long enough that she thought he might have gone back to sleep. Then, "He's been trying to buy my north pasture for 2 years. The fence line I went out to check was cut. 3 sections, clean cuts, not weather damage." She looked at him. "Someone cut your fence." "Someone cut my fence. And then I had an accident on the ice." He said it carefully, in the particular way a man says something when he isn't ready to say it all the way. She held this thought in her mind and turned it slowly, looking at its edges. The fence cut. Nathan going out to check it alone, no one knowing his specific whereabouts because the letter hadn't arrived, no one expecting him back on any particular day. And Roy Casper, who had stood on that platform and laughed, and who had told Dora to put her on the next train, and who had used the word dead with such comfortable certainty. "You think it wasn't an accident?" she said. He didn't answer. Which was, she understood, its own kind of answer. She put the compass in her pocket and stood up. Her legs were stiff from the cold and the long night, and she moved carefully, testing weight before she committed to it, and she went to the ventilation gap and looked out. The snow had dropped to a few scattered flakes. The wind was lower. The sky was still heavy, but no longer the bruised color of the night before. And to the east she could see very faintly the difference between the land and the horizon. "I'm going down to look at the horse," she said. "His name is Calhoun." She looked back at him. "The horse. His name is Calhoun." "All right," she said. "I'm going to look at Calhoun." Calhoun was in good shape, all things considered. He'd gotten through the storm with better equanimity than either of the humans in the building, which she supposed wasn't surprising. She walked around him carefully, checking his legs, looking at the way he held his weight. He watched her with the ear-forward attention he'd shown the night before, neither alarmed nor welcoming, just present. There was a saddle on a rack near the stall, old leather, well cared for, the kind of saddle a man uses because it works rather than because it looks a particular way. There was rope on a peg beside it. She stood and thought about 9 miles of snow and a man with a broken leg and 1 horse. It wasn't a good plan. She knew it wasn't a good plan, but the options were wait in the barn until someone in Harlow Creek decided to send a search party, which Roy Casper would delay as long as he could, or make the 9 miles themselves. And the second storm was still coming. Dora had said so, every trapper and cattle hand who knew the territory. And if the second storm was worse than the first, they might not have a choice about waiting. She went back up the ladder. "Can Calhoun carry double?" she asked. Nathan looked at her. Then he looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at her again. "You mean to get me up on that horse?" "That's what I mean. With a broken leg, yes. And ride 9 miles. With stops." He was quiet for a moment. "He can carry double. He's done it before." He paused. "Getting me down from this loft is going to be a problem." "I know. And getting me up on the horse. I know that too. You'd need—" He stopped, started again. "It's going to hurt." "I know," she said, for the 3rd time. And she said it the same way each time, without apology or softness, because he didn't need her to be sorry about the thing that was true. He needed her to be clear about it. He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. Getting him down from the loft took 40 minutes and was one of the ugliest 40 minutes of Abigail Turner's life. There was no elegant way to do it. She rigged a makeshift system with the rope over the loft beam that let her slow his descent rather than control it, and he worked his upper body with the arm strength of a man who used his arms for a living. And she managed his lower half as best she could, and twice he made the involuntary sound again, and once he said through his teeth a word she chose not to comment on. By the time he was on the barn floor, sitting against the wall with his bad legs stretched out and his face the color of old ash, she was sweating inside the canvas coat despite the cold, and her arms were shaking. She stood still until the shaking stopped. He sat with his eyes closed and breathed, and she let him breathe, and after a while the color came back to his face in thin increments. "I need a minute," he said. "Take 2, she said. He took two. Getting him up on Calhoun was worse. She had the stirrup on the left side, the good leg going up first, and she positioned herself as a brace on the right side, and he got his hands on the saddle horn, and she said on 3, and she counted, and she pushed, and he hauled, and Calhoun, to his considerable credit, stood absolutely still through all of it, just shifted his hindquarters once to compensate for the weight, and settled. Nathan sat in the saddle and went very white and very still, and she watched him and waited. "I'm all right," he said, which they both knew wasn't entirely true, but was true enough to proceed on. She had no horse of her own. She had snowshoes, and she was going to walk. She strapped them on and took Calhoun's lead rope and looked northeast toward Harlow Creek, 9 miles through snow that came to her knee in the shallow places and higher in the drifts, and she thought, good enough. And she started walking. The first mile was the worst. It was always the worst, Dora had told her, which was the kind of thing that only helps a little to know in advance. The snowshoes had to be relearned every time she stopped, the rhythm rebuilt from nothing, and she had been on her feet most of the night before, and her legs had opinions about this which she ignored as thoroughly as she could. Nathan rode without speaking, which she understood. Every step Calhoun took translated somewhere into the broken leg, and talking took energy, and energy was not something either of them had in surplus. She found the first red marker at what she judged was about a mile out. She stopped and verified the direction on the compass and adjusted 3 degrees north. "You found it," Nathan said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. "I found it," she said, and kept moving. She had done this walk once already, yesterday, in the other direction, and she had been afraid then too, but the fear had been fresh then, and now it was familiar, which meant it took less of her attention. She could move through it without negotiating with it. She just walked and counted markers and watched the sky, and stopped every half hour to let Nathan rest and check that he was still conscious and hadn't slid sideways from the saddle. At the third stop, he said, "Why did you come?" She was standing with her hands on her knees, catching her breath. She straightened. "To the barn?" "Here. Wyoming. Why did you answer the advertisement?" She thought about this honestly. "My parents died within 8 months of each other. The house went to debts. I had 43 cents, she paused. "And your letter sounded like you were describing a real arrangement, not a story." He was quiet. "Most of those advertisements," she said, "you can tell the man is describing something he wants the woman to be, something he imagined. Yours was different. You described a real place, real work. You said capable woman of good character, not young or handsome or willing." She adjusted her grip on the lead rope. "I figured a man who knew the difference between capable and handsome was a man worth the risk." He didn't say anything for a moment. The wind moved between them, carrying a fine sift of snow off the surface of the drifts. "What did you think when I wasn't there?" he said. "I was angry," she said. "Then Dora told me about the letter being delayed, and I stopped being angry and started being worried. About a man you'd never met. About a man whose letters sounded like someone worth worrying about." He absorbed this. His face had more color now than it had in the barn. The cold air doing something, or the movement, or possibly just the fact that they were heading towards something instead of away from it. "Roy Casper has been after my north pasture for 2 years, he said. "Offered me fair money the first time, then less. Then he stopped offering." He held the saddle horn and looked at the snow ahead of them. 3 weeks ago, someone cut my fence. Week before that, my wintering cattle in the north pen were let out overnight. I lost 2 head before I got them back. Did you tell anyone in town?" "Who would I tell? Sheriff Aldred takes his evening meals at the Casper house 3 times a week." He said it without bitterness, just information. "I was going to write to the territorial office in Cheyenne. I had papers being drawn up, deed copies, the survey records. Proof that what Casper's been claiming about the boundary line is wrong." She stopped walking. "Where are those papers?" "The ranch house, in a tin box under the kitchen floorboard." She stood in the snow with the compass in one hand and Calhoun's lead rope in the other, and looked at Nathan Brooks sitting on his horse with a broken leg, 3 days of stubble on his jaw, hat pulled low against the wind, and she thought about the papers under the floorboard and Roy Casper's comfortable certainty on the platform and the word solved. "If something had happened to you out here," she said slowly, "if you died in that barn, what would have happened to the ranch?" He met her eyes. "No immediate family. It would have gone to the county. He paused. Which Casper has been cultivating carefully for 2 years. She turned back to the north and started walking again. They went through the fourth marker and the fifth, and the sun broke briefly through the cloud cover around midday, casting a low, flat light across the snow that made everything glow for a few minutes before the clouds closed again. In that brief light, she could see Harlow Creek. She thought she could see it, a dark line of buildings against the white distance, still miles off, but no longer theoretical. Nathan said, "You're not what I expected." She kept walking. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "I don't know, something less certain." "I'm not certain," she said. "I'm just cold and I'd like to get there." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. The sixth marker, the seventh. The sky to the west went gray again in a way she did not like, and she increased her pace as much as her legs would allow, which was not much. Calhoun matched her without being asked, the animal reading something in the shift of her posture or the pull of the rope. They were perhaps 2 miles out when Nathan's voice came down from the saddle, careful and low. "Rider coming?" She looked up. There was a figure on horseback, maybe a quarter-mile ahead, coming toward them on the road. Moving fast, then slowing as they apparently caught sight of the two of them. She went still. She thought about Roy Casper. She thought about the fence and the cattle and what the word accident meant when a man said it carefully. The rider got closer. It was a woman. She could tell by the way she sat the horse, upright in the particular way, and then by the gray wool coat. Dora Finch pulled up her mare 6 feet away and looked at the two of them with an expression that was simultaneously severe and something she was working to contain. "You found him," she said. "I found him. He's alive." "He is." Dora looked at Nathan. "Nathan Brooks, you look like something the weather chewed on and spat back." "That's about accurate," he said. "Can you ride the rest of the way in?" "We've made it this far." Dora dismounted. She came and stood beside Abigail and looked her over in the way she'd looked her over in the store, measuring, pragmatic, without comment on what she saw. "Tom Gale saw your smoke signals this morning," she said. "I didn't send any smoke signals." Dora frowned. "Then how—" "I just came." Dora absorbed this. She looked at Abigail's legs, the snowshoes, the 9 miles behind them. She looked at Calhoun's lead rope in Abigail's hand. "You walked," she said. "I did. 9 miles. In that." She gestured at the general situation. The snow, the cold, the physical fact of what 9 miles on snowshoes after a sleepless night meant. "There and back," Abigail said. "Yes." Dora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right," in a tone of voice that contained several things at once, and she turned her mare and fell into step beside them. They came into Harlow Creek from the northeast in the flat gray light of mid-afternoon, 2 women on foot and 1 man on horseback, the man barely upright and the women not looking much better. The first person who saw them was a boy named Henry Crane, who ran for his mother, and his mother ran for Doc Waverly. And by the time they reached the main street, there were 7 people out of doors in the cold watching them come. Roy Casper was one of them. He stood on the boardwalk in front of the saloon, and he watched her come in out of the snow with Nathan Brooks alive on Calhoun's back. And his face went through several things in quick succession before it settled into something flat and controlled. She looked at him as she passed. She didn't stop. She didn't speak. She just looked at him. Steady, level, the same look she'd been giving the horizon for the last 9 miles. And then she looked away and kept moving, because Nathan needed to get off that horse and into a warm room, and the sky was going gray again in the west. Doc Waverly was a compact man of 60 with quick hands and a manner that managed to be both brusque and careful at once. He took one look at Nathan's leg and said 2 words, "compound stress," and started giving instructions to the 2 men who'd helped get Nathan off the horse, and Abigail stepped back and let him work. Dora appeared at her elbow. She pressed something warm into her hand. Coffee in a ceramic mug. Abigail wrapped both hands around it and felt the heat move up through her palms and into her wrists, and she stood in the doorway of Doc Waverly's office and drank the coffee and listened to Nathan making the involuntary sound again as the doc worked, and she thought about the tin box under the kitchen floorboard at the Brooks Ranch and what was in it. "He told me about the fence," she said quietly to Dora. Dora had her own cup. She turned it slowly. I know about the fence. He thinks the accident wasn't. Dora didn't say anything for a moment. I've thought so too, she said finally. For a while. The papers he has, the deed copies and the survey records, they're in a tin box at the ranch house. Dora looked at her. If Casper knows those papers exist, Abigail said, and Nathan is laid up here with a broken leg and can't get back to the ranch, I'll send Tom Gale tonight, Dora said, before the next storm. Send him now. There may not be a tonight. Dora set her cup on the window ledge and went to the door and said something to someone outside that Abigail couldn't hear, and then came back. Done, she said. Abigail drank the rest of the coffee. Her feet, now that she had stopped moving, were making themselves known again in the particular way they'd been making themselves known for the last 2 hours of walking, which was a deep bruised aching that she suspected had more to it than cold fatigue. Doc Waverly came out of the inner room wiping his hands on a towel. He looked at Abigail. He wants to see you, he said. She went in. Nathan was on a narrow bed, his legs set and wrapped and elevated on a folded blanket. He had more color than he'd had in the barn, or possibly it was just the lamplight. He looked at her when she came in, and there was something different in it from how he'd looked at her before, a quality of attention that had nothing to do with medical necessity. He says 6 weeks, Nathan said. That's not so long. 6 weeks on my back while Casper spa. He stopped. His jaw worked. I have 50 head of cattle that need tending and a ranch that doesn't run itself. I know, she said. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. You can't. He stopped again. He looked at the ceiling and then at her. You didn't sign on for this. I signed on for a fair arrangement, she said. The arrangement is complicated right now. That doesn't mean it's over. He was quiet. Tell me what needs doing at the ranch, she said. Tell me who you trust and who you don't and what the cattle need and where the feed is. Tell me what I need to know. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the wind had come up again, rattling the window in its frame, and somewhere down the street, someone closed a door hard against the weather. You just walked 9 miles in a blizzard, he said. You should sleep. I will, she said, after you tell me what I need to know. He looked at her. She looked back. He started talking. She listened to every word. Tom Gale made it to the Brooks Ranch and back before the second storm closed in, which said something about Tom Gale that Abigail filed away for later. He came into Dora's store at 8:30 that evening with snow in his beard and a tin box under his arm, and he set it on the counter without ceremony and said, Found it where Nathan said. Also found this. And he put down a folded piece of paper beside the box. That was wedged under the front door. Wasn't there when Nathan left, or it would have blown away weeks ago. Dora unfolded it. She read it. Her face did not change, which meant it was bad. She handed it to Abigail. It was a notice, official-looking, printed on county letterhead, dated 4 days prior. It stated that the property known as the Brooks Ranch, Northeast Parcel, Harlow Creek District, was subject to a lien claim filed by R. Casper on grounds of an outstanding debt, and that unless the claim was disputed in writing within 30 days to the county assessor's office in Cheyenne, the lien would be recorded and proceedings would begin. Abigail read it twice. Then she set it on the counter next to the tin box. He filed while Nathan was missing, she said. Filed the same week Nathan went out to check that fence, Tom said. He was looking at the floor. He was a quiet man, Tom Gale, the kind who noticed things and didn't make speeches about them. County assessor is a man named Pritchard. He and Casper go back. Is the debt real? Nathan doesn't owe Casper a cent. Never has. Tom looked up. But the filing's real enough to tie things up. Takes time to fight a lien. Takes money to fight a lien. Takes a lawyer in Cheyenne, which means travel, which means Nathan, with a broken leg and 6 weeks of recovery, is exactly where Casper needs him, Abigail said. Nobody said anything for a moment. She picked up the tin box. It wasn't locked. The latch was a simple clasp, the kind you'd use for something you wanted to access quickly, rather than something you were trying to protect. Inside were papers folded carefully, the original deed, a survey record with hand-drawn boundary lines, 3 letters from a surveyor in Laramie, and a copy of a county map with handwritten notations in Nathan's cramped writing marking exactly where the true boundary of the north pasture ran. She spread the papers on the counter and looked at them for a long time. "He has a case," she said. "He has a case," Dora agreed, "if someone takes it to Cheyenne." Abigail looked at Dora. Dora looked back. "I've never been to Cheyenne," Abigail said. "It's a straight line south. Train goes 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday." Dora paused. "Today's Wednesday." "Thursday train," Abigail said. "You'd need to find the Territorial Land Office and a lawyer who'll take the case on terms Nathan can pay later." Dora folded her hands on the counter. "And you'd need to do it before Casper finds out those papers are gone from the ranch, because the moment he knows, things will move faster." Tom Gale cleared his throat. "Casper's got a man watching the ranch road. Saw him on my way back, sitting on a horse up on the ridge, acting like he was just passing through." He pulled his coat straighter. "He's not just watching, he's counting." Abigail put the papers back in the tin box. She closed the clasp. She went to see Nathan. He was awake, which the doc had said was good, and propped up on 2 folded blankets, which the doc had said was necessary. He looked better than he had that afternoon, which was not saying a great deal. He looked like a man who'd spent 5 days in a barn with a broken leg and had then been jostled 9 miles on horseback, because that was what he was. The lamplight was doing its best for him. She sat in the chair and put the tin box on the bed beside him and told him about the lien notice. She said it plain and straight, without softening it, because he was the kind of man who would do better with plain and straight than with anything cushioned. He read the notice himself, holding it close to the lamp, his jaw set in a line she was beginning to recognize. "Pritchard," he said when he finished. "Tom mentioned him. Pritchard and Casper hunted together for years. Casper's daughter married Pritchard's nephew." He set the notice down on the blanket. "He's been working this for a long time." "I can take the papers to Cheyenne," she said. "Thursday train. I can find the land office and file a dispute and find a lawyer." He looked at her. "I know you don't know me," she said. "I know we've spoken about 12 sentences to each other before tonight. And I know this is a large thing to hand to a stranger." She looked at the tin box. "But I'm here and I can do this, and I think you need someone to do it before Thursday is too late." He was quiet for a moment. "You have money for the train?" She did not. He reached under the edge of the mattress. She watched him do it, watched the wince he couldn't suppress, and pulled out a flat leather wallet. He counted out enough for the train fare and something extra and held it out to her. "The lawyer's name is Samuel Holt," he said. "He has an office on Ferguson Street in Cheyenne. I was going to write to him. Tell him I sent you." She took the money. "What if he won't see me?" Nathan looked at her steadily. "Tell him the lien notice is dated 4 days ago, and I've been in a barn with a broken leg, and if he wants the case, it needs to move now." He paused. "Sam Holt is a man who responds to urgency. He's not a man who responds to waiting." She put the money in her coat pocket next to the compass. "Get some sleep," he said. "I will." "Abigail." She stopped at the door. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention he'd had when she'd first sat down, measured, revised, something still being worked out in the arithmetic of it. "What you did today," he said. "Coming out there. I know what that cost, physically. I know what 9 miles in that is." She waited. "I'm not a man who says thank you easily," he said. "I'm working on it." She nodded once and went out. She slept hard that night on Dora's cot, the stovepipe ticking above her, and woke before dawn without needing to be woken, which was a thing her body had always done when it knew something important was happening the next day. She dressed in the dark and checked the tin box and counted the money and waited for it to be late enough to move. The second storm came in before sunrise. She heard it arrive, the wind first, as always, changing pitch and then changing character, and then the sound of the snow against the window, which was different from rain, drier and more deliberate, like something being thrown rather than falling. By the time the gray light came up enough to see by, Front Street was invisible past 20 feet. She went to the window and looked at nothing and thought about Thursday. Dora came in an hour later with coffee and the kind of expression that didn't require explaining. "How bad?" Abigail asked. Tom says this one will run 2, maybe 3 days, maybe longer. She set the coffee down. The train won't run in this. Abigail stood at the window. Thursday may not be possible, Dora said, not unkindly. Saturday, then. Abigail, the notice says 30 days from filing. That's 30 days from whatever date Casper chose, which means some of those days are already gone. She turned from the window. I'm not going back east. I want to be clear about that. Whatever happens here, I'm not going back east. Dora looked at her for a moment. Then she sat down at the small table and wrapped both hands around her own cup. Roy Casper is going to make things difficult for you. He's been difficult since the minute I stepped off the train. That was a different kind of difficult. That was cruelty. This is something more organized. Dora's voice was careful. He has the money, and he has friends, and he has time. He's been patient for 2 years. He's not going to let one woman from Ohio walk into a lawyer's office in Cheyenne and undo 4 months of planning. He doesn't know I have the papers. He'll find out. Tom says there's a man watching the ranch road. If that man followed Tom back, Tom said he didn't see anyone following. Tom is a good man who is not infallible. Abigail drank her coffee. She thought about the tin box under the cot where she'd put it, and she thought about Roy Casper on the platform and how certain he'd been. And she thought about the particular kind of certainty that comes from a man who has never once had things not go his way. He came by yesterday afternoon, Dora said quietly. Abigail looked at her. While you were with Nathan, he came in here, very polite, asked how Nathan was doing, asked how long the recovery would be. She paused, asked if Nathan had anyone to manage his affairs while he was laid up. What did you tell him? I told him Nathan was resting and I'd pass along his good wishes. Dora turned her cup. He asked about you. What did he ask? Whether you were planning to stay, whether Nathan had, how did he put it, whether Nathan had committed to the arrangement. She looked at Abigail directly. He knew about the advertisement. He knew Nathan had sent for someone. He knew the letter had been delayed. The room was very quiet except for the storm. He knew, Abigail said slowly, that the letter was delayed. Dora's expression said she had already arrived at this thought and had been sitting with it. Cheyenne Postal Station, Abigail said. The letter sat there 2 weeks before it was forwarded. That doesn't happen by accident. It can happen by accident. But if it didn't, she set her cup down. If someone made sure Nathan didn't know I was coming, made sure he went out to check that fence before I arrived, before there was anyone at the ranch with him who might notice he hadn't come back. Dora was quiet. He planned for Nathan to die out there, Abigail said. It came out flat, matter of fact, the way difficult things sometimes need to come out when you're saying them for the first time. The cut fence to draw him out, the letter delayed so there was no one waiting, and then a man alone in a territory in February doesn't come back, and nobody's surprised. You can't prove any of that, Dora said. No, Abigail agreed, but the land records can prove the lien is fraudulent, and that's where I'm starting. The storm ran 2.5 days. She spent those 2.5 days in a way that surprised even herself. She spent the first morning with the papers from the tin box, reading every document slowly and making notes on the back of brown wrapping paper that Dora gave her. Dates, names, boundary descriptions, the surveyor's measurements, the discrepancies between what the county record showed and what Nathan's papers showed. She was not a lawyer. She had not gone to school past the age of 14. But she was meticulous in the way her mother had been meticulous, and she had a mind that held numbers the way some minds hold music, and by the end of the morning she had a clear picture of what the papers said and what they meant. She spent the afternoon at Doc Waverly's, sitting with Nathan. He was sharper by then, the worst of the shock having worked through his system, and he talked her through the land history. When he'd bought the parcel, what the survey had found, where the Casper claim overlapped and why it was wrong, and who in Cheyenne might know the territory well enough to corroborate the surveyor's findings. He had a good mind for this, a methodical mind. She understood, listening to him, that he had been building this case quietly for 2 years without anyone knowing he was building it, and that Roy Casper, for all his planning, had underestimated the man he was moving against. You should have gone to Cheyenne yourself a year ago, she said. I know. He shifted against the blankets carefully. I kept thinking I could resolve it here, without making it a legal matter. He paused. I don't like lawyers. You're going to have to get over that. I'm aware. Samuel Holt. Sam's all right. He's expensive and he talks too much and he's right more than he's wrong, which is the combination that matters. She wrote the name on her paper again underneath the notes. Samuel Holt, Ferguson Street. Urgent. On the second day of the storm, Roy Casper came to Doc Waverly's office. She was there when he arrived. She heard his voice in the outer room, that particular timbre, the volume of a man who assumes the room belongs to him, and she sat still in her chair beside Nathan's bed and waited. He came to the inner room doorway. He knocked on the open door, which was the courtesy version of not knocking. Nathan, he said. Hell of a thing. Glad you're alive. Nathan looked at him without expression. Roy. Casper's eyes moved to Abigail. They stayed there for a moment, doing the same work they'd done on the platform. Assessment, calculation, the filing away of information. Then they moved back to Nathan. Came to see how you were getting on, Casper said, and to say, I know this is a hard time. If there's anything needs managing at the ranch while you're laid up, I've got men who can help. I've got help, Nathan said, the briefest pause. That right. It is. Casper turned his attention to Abigail again, slower this time. Miss Turner, you're still in Harlow Creek. I am, she said. Plan to stay a while? I do. He smiled. It was a full, sociable smile, the kind he'd clearly practiced enough to make it look easy. Well, that's fine. That's just fine. He looked back at Nathan. The offer stands. Anything you need. I'll keep it in mind, Nathan said. Casper left. Neither of them spoke for a moment after the sound of his boots faded. He knows the papers are gone, Nathan said. Yes. He came to see who has them. Yes. Nathan looked at the ceiling. The line of his jaw was tight in a way she'd learned to read. He's going to move faster now. Then so are we, she said. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. The sky came out flat and hard and very blue, and the cold was extraordinary, the kind that makes the air itself feel brittle. But the wind was down and the road south was visible, and at 11 o'clock in the morning, Abigail Turner stood on the Harlow Creek platform for the second time in a week, this time with a tin box under her arm and a ticket to Cheyenne in her pocket. Dora was there. Tom Gale was there. Doc Waverly had come out, which she hadn't expected, and he stood with his hands in his coat pockets and nodded at her in a way that meant something without being specific about what. She had gone to say goodbye to Nathan that morning. He had been sitting up, which the doc had reluctantly permitted, and he had looked at her with the expression she'd seen developing over the last 3 days, the ongoing revision, the arithmetic not yet complete. You have everything, he'd said. Yes. If Holt gives you trouble, tell him the survey from Laramie is from 1879 and predates Casper's claim by 2 years. He'll know what that means. All right. And Abigail. He stopped. He looked at his hands, then at her. Be careful who you talk to about this on the train. Casper has friends south of here. I'll be careful. He nodded. Then he said, in a different register, lower and less structured, I wish I could go myself. I know. I don't like sending you into... Nathan. She said it quietly. You didn't send me. I'm going. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face did what she'd seen it do in the barn loft, on Calhoun's back, moved through several things before settling somewhere she couldn't quite read. But that wasn't dismissal and wasn't pity and wasn't what Roy Casper's face had done on the platform. All right, he said. The train came from the north, on time for once, and she got on it with the tin box and found a seat near the window and watched Harlow Creek pull back and then disappear behind a curve of white hill. She was alone. She was on a train to a city she'd never been to, carrying legal papers that a dangerous man wanted, to find a lawyer she'd never met, to dispute a lien on land that belonged to a man she'd known for 4 days. This was, she thought, an extraordinary sequence of events for a woman who had left Ohio with 43 cents and a mother's thimble. Cheyenne was larger than she'd expected. After Harlow Creek, it felt enormous. The noise and the traffic and the number of people moving through the streets without looking at each other, which was its own kind of anonymity she found she didn't mind. She found a boarding house 3 blocks from the station, cheap and clean enough, run by a woman named Mrs. Astor, who took her money without comment and showed her to a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked onto a courtyard. She found Ferguson Street on a hand-drawn map the station master had given her. Samuel Holt's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building, up a narrow staircase, behind a door with his name painted in black letters on frosted glass. She knocked. A voice told her to come in. He was younger than she'd expected from Nathan's description. 40, maybe, with a narrow face and the kind of eyes that moved quickly and recorded things. His desk was covered in papers, which he made no attempt to organize before she sat down, which she took as a good sign. "Mr. Holt," she said. "My name is Abigail Turner. Nathan Brooks sent me." Something shifted in his expression. "Nathan Brooks," he repeated. "I've been waiting on a letter from Nathan Brooks for 6 weeks. He's been in the hospital with a broken leg. He went out to check his north fence line, which had been cut, and had an accident on the ice." She set the tin box on the desk. "He was alone in a barn for 5 days before I found him. While he was missing, Roy Casper filed a lien against his north pasture. The notice arrived at the ranch 4 days ago. Nathan says you'll understand what that means and what needs to move." Holt looked at the tin box. He looked at her. "You found him?" "Yes." "By yourself?" "Yes." "In a February blizzard. It was the first storm. The second one hit while he was recovering." Holt steepled his fingers. He looked at her with the quick eyes, and she looked back. "What's in the box?" "The original deed. The 1879 Laramie survey. 3 letters from the surveyor. Nathan's copies of the county boundary records with his own notations, and the lien notice." Holt reached across the desk and opened the box. He went through the papers with focused efficiency. Not fast, but not slow either. And she watched him read and watched his expression, and when he got to the 1879 survey, she saw something change. "Nathan said you'd know what that means," she said. "It means Casper's claim is built on the 1883 county resurvey, which had an error in it that's been disputed for 3 years but never corrected in the official record." Holt set the paper down. "The 1879 survey predates the error. It puts the boundary line 140 feet east of where Casper says it runs." He looked at her. "Which means the pasture Casper is claiming doesn't touch Nathan's property at all." "The debt he's claiming?" "Non-existent, I'd wager. Manufactured for the lien." He sat back. "This is a serious case, Miss Turner. Nathan said you were the man for it." "He said that." "In different words." Holt almost smiled. "What he probably said is that I'm expensive and I talk too much. He also said you're right more than you're wrong. That's the truest thing he's ever said about me." He tapped the 1879 survey with one finger. "I'll need to take copies of these. I'll file a dispute with the assessor's office tomorrow morning first thing. Pritchard won't like it." He said the name with the particular inflection of a man who knows another man's character completely and does not think well of it. "Is Nathan in a position to give written authorization?" "I have a letter." She reached into her coat and produced it. 2 pages in Nathan's cramped handwriting, which he'd written that morning propped against a folded blanket, authorizing Abigail Turner to act on his behalf in all matters pertaining to the lien dispute and the property records of the Brooks Ranch, Northeast Parcel, Harlow Creek District. She put it on the desk. Holt read it carefully. He looked at the signature. He looked at her. "He wrote this morning," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "From a hospital bed." "From Doc Waverly's spare room, technically." Holt put the letter down and looked at the papers spread across his desk and was quiet for a moment. "Miss Turner, I'm going to ask you something that isn't my business." "Go ahead." "How do you come to be doing this? For a man you've, I presume, known for a very short time." She considered the question honestly. "I came here as a mail-order bride," she said. "He didn't know I was coming because his letter was delayed, and I think that delay was deliberate. He went out to a fence line that was cut, and I think that was deliberate too. He nearly died alone in a barn in February because someone arranged for him to be alone and for nobody to be expecting him back." She looked at Holt steadily. And the same man who arranged all of that laughed at me on a train platform the day I arrived and told me to get on the next train east. So I have reasons that are about Nathan, and I have reasons that are about me, and right now the two things point in the same direction. Holt looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make coffee." He made it strong, and he talked while he made it, which she'd been warned about. But what he said was useful. The steps, the timeline, who in the Territorial Land Office was trustworthy, and who was connected to the County Assessment Board, how long the dispute process would take, what Roy Casper's countermoves were likely to be. She listened to every word and wrote the key things on the back of her brown paper. When she left his office 2 hours later, she had a receipt for the documents, a copy of the authorization letter with Holt's counter-signature, and a clear sequence of next steps written in her own hand. She stood on Ferguson Street in the cold Cheyenne afternoon and looked at the paper. The street was full of people who didn't know her or Nathan or Harlow Creek or Roy Casper's laugh on a train platform, and she stood among them and felt, for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, something that wasn't quite hope. Hope was too soft a word for it, but was something more functional. A sense that the situation was not fixed, that there were things to do and she was doing them, and that mattered. She walked back toward the boarding house. She had a letter to write to Nathan. She had notes to organize. She had a meeting with the Territorial Land Office tomorrow at 9 o'clock, which Holt had arranged with a speed she appreciated, and she had a train back to Harlow Creek on Saturday. She had work. It was enough. For today, it was enough. She did not let herself think about what Casper might be doing in Harlow Creek while she was gone, because that thought had no floor to it, and she needed to stay on solid ground. She bought a small supper at a place near the boarding house, soup and bread, the cheapest thing on the board, and she sat at a corner table and ate it alone, and thought about the tin box and the 1879 survey and the 140 feet that meant the difference between a man keeping his land and a man losing it. She thought about Nathan's cramped handwriting, the 3 letters, worn soft at the folds, capable woman of good character. She was going to be both of those things. She was going to be both of those things until there was no more need for them, or until she ran out of room, whichever came last. She finished her supper and went upstairs and sat at the small desk by the window and began to write. The letter she wrote to Nathan that night ran 4 pages. She had not intended 4 pages. She had intended a clear, functional summary of what Holt had said and what the next steps were, the kind of thing that could be read quickly by a man lying in a spare room with a broken leg who didn't have the energy for anything that wasn't necessary. But somewhere between the land office appointment and the explanation of the 1879 survey discrepancy, she found herself writing other things, about the boarding house and the courtyard window and the soup she'd eaten alone at the corner table. And she let herself write them because it was late and she was tired and she had not had anyone to tell things to in a very long time. She crossed out the personal parts before she folded it. Then she sat for a moment looking at the crossed out lines, and she unfolded the letter and wrote them back in, because the situation was what it was, and there was no particular point in pretending it was something else. She posted it in the morning on her way to the Territorial Land Office. The Land Office was a low stone building 3 blocks from Holt's office, staffed by a man named Gideon Marsh, who was somewhere in his late 50s and had the look of a person who had spent 30 years doing careful work in a small room and was not unhappy about it. He received her with professional courtesy that was not the same thing as warmth, but was considerably better than what she'd encountered from the county assessor's man the day before, a thin, nervous person named Alcott, who had taken the dispute filing from her with visible reluctance and told her 3 times that Mr. Pritchard would need to review it personally. Marsh listened to her lay out the case with his hands folded on his desk. He asked 2 questions. He looked at the copies Holt had sent with her, the 1879 survey, the deed, the boundary notation. And he was quiet for long enough that she began to calculate what she'd do if this also came to nothing. Then he said, "The 1883 re-survey error. I know the one." She waited. It was filed by a deputy assessor who has since resigned under separate circumstances. He said this carefully, in the manner of a man describing something he has an opinion about and has chosen not to express directly. "The error was noted internally at the time and never corrected in the public record. We've been aware of it. He looked at the 1879 document again. This is the original Laramie survey. Yes. And Mr. Brooks has held this since, he checked the date, since 1879. Before Casper's boundary claim existed, she said. Marsh unfolded his hands and refolded them. Miss Turner, I'm going to be direct with you. Please. The assessor's office in Harlow Creek is not the territorial land office. Mr. Pritchard has authority within his district, but his authority does not supersede the territorial record. He tapped the survey. If this document is filed with us as a counterclaim to the lien, it creates a conflict in the public record that cannot be resolved at the district level. It would have to come to us. He looked at her. Which means it would come to me. She understood what he was saying. How long does that take? In normal circumstances, 6 to 8 weeks. And in these circumstances? He looked at the survey again. I have discretion about what constitutes an urgent matter requiring expedited review. He paused. A fraudulent lien filed while the property owner was incapacitated and unable to respond could be argued to constitute such a matter. She looked at him steadily. Would you argue it? I believe I would, he said. She took the train back to Harlow Creek on Saturday. The landscape out the window was the same flat white it had been going south, but the sky had changed, higher and thinner, the deep, hard blue of winter, starting to consider something else without yet committing. She sat with her coat on her lap and Holt's receipt in her pocket and Marsh's name on her brown paper with 2 stars beside it, and she watched Wyoming go by and thought about what came next. What came next was the ranch. Nathan had spent the last 3 days of her absence talking to Tom Gale and to Doc Waverly and to Dora, and between them they had assembled a rough picture of what the Brooks Ranch needed immediately and what could wait, and who in the area might be willing to help work it for wages Nathan couldn't currently pay. It was a short list for both categories. The immediate needs were long and the willing workers were few. Most of the men in the area worked for wages that Casper either set or influenced, and nobody was eager to be seen taking the opposite side of a dispute that hadn't been resolved yet. She came back to Doc Waverly's office from the station directly, without stopping at Dora's. She knocked and went in, and Nathan was sitting up again, properly sitting up this time, not propped, his back against the wall, and a ledger open across his good leg. And he looked up when she came in, and something in his face moved. How did it go? He said. She sat down and told him, all of it, in order, the same plain way she'd told him about the storm on the train platform, Holt and the 1879 survey and what it meant, Alcott at the assessor's office and his reluctance, Marsh at the territorial land office, and what he'd said about expedited review. Nathan was quiet through all of it, listening with the same focused attention she'd come to recognize. He didn't interrupt, didn't nod excessively, just listened and processed and held it. When she finished, he said, Marsh said expedited review, with 2 conditions, that Holt files the counterclaim formally by end of next week, and that you provide a sworn statement about the condition of the fence when you found it cut. The cut fence. His jaw did the thing it did. I should have documented that the day I found it. You didn't know what you were going to need it for. I knew something was wrong. Knowing something is wrong and knowing you'll be in a barn for 5 days with a broken leg trying to prove it in court are different things. She said it without sharpness. You can write the statement from here. Doc Waverly can witness it. He looked at the ledger on his leg. I owe you money for the train. We'll settle it later. Abigail. Nathan. She looked at him directly. Later. He closed the ledger. He looked at her with the expression she'd been watching develop since the barn loft, the one that kept arriving at some point of consideration and then stopping just short of whatever was on the other side of it, and she had decided by now that she understood what it was. Not reluctance exactly, but caution. The specific caution of a man who had arranged his life to need very little from other people and was finding that arrangement harder to maintain than it used to be. The ranch needs work, he said. I know. Tom can't do it alone. I have 53 head that need tending, and the Southwater trough needs repair, and I have hay stores for another 3 weeks if nothing goes wrong, and considerably less than that if something does. I know, she said again. You've never worked a cattle ranch. I've never done most of what I've done in the last 2 weeks. She said it simply. I learn. He was quiet. Tell me what needs doing first, she said. She moved into the ranch house the following Monday. It was a straightforward decision made for practical reasons, and she made it without ceremony and without asking anyone's permission, because the cattle needed tending, and the alternative was riding out 9 miles from Dora's store every morning and 9 miles back every evening, and that was 9 miles that could be spent more usefully. Dora understood. Doc Waverly didn't comment. Nathan, when she told him, was quiet for a moment and then said, "There's a second bedroom, door latches from the inside," which was his version of the same conversation said in fewer words. The ranch house was plain and functional and had not been tended to in any way that wasn't purely structural for the 4 years Nathan had lived in it. There were dishes and a stove and a table with 2 chairs and a lamp that needed a new wick, and firewood stacked by the back door, and that was approximately the full inventory of domesticity. The walls had no pictures. The shelves had no decoration. There was a calendar from 1881 still nailed to the kitchen wall, 2 years out of date, and she took it down and replaced it with the current one she'd bought in Cheyenne. Tom Gale met her at the ranch the first morning and walked her through what he knew, which was considerable. He was a patient teacher, which surprised her, or perhaps it didn't. Patient people often did the kind of work that Tom did, solitary and physical and dependent on paying attention. He showed her the cattle in the South Pen and how to check them. And he showed her the hay stores and how to measure what was left accurately. And he showed her the water trough problem, which was a split in the wood along the east seam that was manageable now, but would become critical once the temperatures dropped again. She took notes on the brown paper. She ran out of brown paper and started using the back of the Cheyenne boarding house receipt. The work was harder than she had represented to Nathan, and she had known it would be. Her body had not recovered from the 9-mile walks and the barn loft night as fully as she'd pretended, and the cold was a daily physical negotiation, and there were mornings when she stood in the yard in the early dark before Tom arrived and simply breathed through the weight of it, not ready to stop, but needing a moment to acknowledge that the thing was heavy before picking it up again. She did not write this to Nathan. She wrote him about the cattle count and the hay stores and the water trough repair she and Tom had improvised with wood sealer from Dora's supply. And she wrote him about the small things, the way the morning light came in from the east across the snow, the sound the cattle made in the early cold that she'd learned to distinguish between content and troubled. She wrote these things partly because they were true, and partly because she thought a man lying in a spare room needed to know his land was being observed rather than just managed. He wrote back. His letters were short and cramped and always contained at least one specific question about some aspect of the ranch that she hadn't mentioned, which she understood was his way of checking on things without appearing to check on them. She answered the questions in full and then asked her own, and somewhere in the second week the correspondence shifted. So gradually she almost didn't notice, from purely functional to something that was functional and also other things. Roy Casper made his next move on a Thursday. She was in the barn with Tom, checking Calhoun's feet. The ice conditions had been rough on his frogs, and she'd been monitoring it, when she heard the horses. 2 of them, coming from the south road. She came out of the barn and stood in the yard. Casper was on the larger horse. The man beside him she didn't know. Heavy built, with a flat expression and the particular bearing of someone who was there to be imposing rather than to do anything specific. "Miss Turner," Casper said. He didn't dismount. "Didn't realize you'd taken up residence." "I'm managing the ranch while Nathan recovers." She kept her voice level. "Can I help you with something?" "Just riding through." He looked past her at the barn, at the yard, at the house. He was cataloging, she understood, taking inventory of what was here and who was managing it, and how well. "Thought I'd check in on the property, in an informal capacity." "The property is fine." "Glad to hear it." He looked back at her. The smile was deployed again, easy and practiced. "I heard you went to Cheyenne." She said nothing. "Business trip?" he said. "I had some things to attend to," she said. "Long way to go in February." He shifted in the saddle. "I hope it was worth the trip." "It was." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at the man beside him, and something moved between them that was not language, and he looked back at her. "Nathan's a lucky man," he said, "having someone look after his affairs." He said the word affairs with a specific flatness that was designed to mean something and to have no witnesses to the meaning. You let him know I came by." "I will," she said. They rode south. Tom came out of the barn and stood beside her and watched them go. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "He knows about the filing," she said. "Yes," Tom said. "He came to see how much we know about what he's doing." "Yes." Tom pulled his hat down. "He'll be back with something more organized than a ride-through." She wrote to Nathan that night. She told him about the visit. She told him what Casper had said and how he'd said it and what the man beside him had looked like. She asked him directly, "What does Casper do when something isn't working the way he planned?" Nathan's answer came 2 days later, shorter than usual. 3 lines. "He gets the ground to shift under you. He doesn't come at you directly. He changes what you're standing on." She read this 3 times and thought about what ground she was standing on. The ground she was standing on was the ranch, the papers, Holt and Cheyenne, Marsh at the territorial office, Tom Gale, Dora, Nathan in Doc Waverly's spare room, getting stronger in increments that were visible if you looked on the right scale. And the thing she was standing on that Casper perhaps hadn't fully accounted for yet, the fact that she had nothing to lose. She had come here with 43 cents. Everything she had now she had made from nothing in 3 weeks, and a man who wants to shift the ground under you needs there to be ground that you're afraid to lose. She was afraid to lose it. She was honest with herself about that. She had started to want this, the ranch, the work, the letters, the sense of something being built rather than abandoned. She was afraid of losing it in the way you're afraid of losing something real, not something theoretical. But the fear sat differently than it would have sat a month ago. A month ago, it would have paralyzed her. Now it sat beside her like bad weather, present, acknowledged, and not in charge. Doc Waverly cleared Nathan to return to the ranch at the 4-week mark rather than the 6-week one, with conditions. No weight on the leg without the crutches, no riding for another month, and rest that was genuine rather than performed. She drove the wagon in to collect him on a morning that was cold but clear, the sky doing its late winter thing of suggesting spring without committing to it. Dora came out of the store to see him loaded into the wagon and said, "Try not to go back to any barns," which was about as emotional as Dora got. Doc Waverly gave her a list of instructions for the leg in handwriting nearly as bad as Nathan's. The 9 miles back to the ranch were slow. She drove carefully, watching for the rough patches, and Nathan sat beside her on the wagon seat with his crutches across his knees and looked at his land coming back to him piece by piece as they went northeast. He didn't say anything for the first 4 miles. Then he said, "You fixed the water trough." "Tom helped." "Tom told me you designed the repair. He just did the cutting." She kept her eyes on the road. "It needed doing. The south pen looks good. The cattle are fine. We lost some weight in the bad weather, but nothing we can't get back once the grass comes in." He was quiet again for a while. She navigated around a drift that the road crew hadn't cleared yet, going wide into the field margin and back, and he steadied himself on the seat without complaint. "The calendar," he said. She glanced at him. "You changed the calendar in the kitchen. The other one was 2 years out of date." "I know, I just—" He stopped. He looked at the road ahead. "I noticed." She let this sit without filling it. The ranch house came into view around the last bend, low and plain against the snow, smoke coming from the chimney because she'd banked the fire before she left that morning, and Tom had agreed to check it. It looked the same as it had looked for 4 years, she supposed, but she had lived in it for 3 weeks now, and she saw the changes she'd made, small ones, practical ones, a bundle of dried herbs on the kitchen windowsill because they'd been in Dora's stock and cost 2 cents and made the room smell like something other than coal dust, and wood stacked in a more accessible arrangement by the back door, and the lamp with its new wick burning cleanly. Nathan came through the door on his crutches and stopped. He stood in the kitchen and looked at it. She stood behind him and waited. "The herbs," he said. "They were cheap." "I'm not complaining." He moved to the table and sat down, and the relief of sitting in his own chair was visible in his body, a specific relaxing that had nothing to do with the leg. He looked around the kitchen with the expression of a man recalibrating. She made coffee. It was what she did when she didn't know what else to do, and it was useful more often than not. They sat at the table with their cups and the late afternoon light coming in from the west, and outside the cattle in the south, Penn were making the particular sound she'd learned to identify as content. And Calhoun was in the barn, and the fire was doing what it was supposed to do. Holt sent a letter, she said. Arrived yesterday. He filed the counterclaim Monday. Marsh acknowledged receipt. Good. He says Pritchard pushed back on the expedited review request. Marsh overruled him. She turned her cup. Casper's going to know by now. Yes. What does he do next? Nathan thought about this. He was looking at his coffee, but she understood by now that when he looked at his coffee, he wasn't looking at his coffee. He has two options left, he said. He can try to attack the 1879 survey itself, argue it was incorrectly recorded, find some procedural issue with it, or he can come at the people involved rather than the documents. She looked at him. He came here last week, she said. He was looking at things. I know. Tom told me. Nathan's jaw did the thing. He's going to try to make you leave. He already tried that on the platform. This time it won't be a laugh. He met her eyes. He'll use something real, or something that looks real. He'll find something or make something and he'll use it. He said it without drama, just clear assessment. He can't come at the land directly anymore, not while Marsh has the file, so he'll come at the people standing on it. She thought about what ground she was standing on and what Casper might think she was afraid to lose. He'll come at the arrangement, she said slowly. He'll try to make it look improper. An unmarried woman living in a man's house. Nathan was quiet. In a town where he controls the narrative, she said. Sheriff Aldred takes his supper at Casper's house, Nathan said, which was what he'd said before, but it meant something more specific now. She sat with this. It was a real problem. She understood that it was a real problem, not because of what it was, but because of how it would look in a small town in Wyoming territory in 1883, and how Casper would make it look, and who would believe what once he applied his particular kind of pressure to the story. She could move back to Dora's. She'd thought about this before. It would solve the optics, and it would mean 9 miles each way every day on a wagon through mud that was going to get worse before it got better as the thaw came, and it would mean no one at the ranch after dark. And it would mean... She stopped that thought. She looked at Nathan. He was looking at her with the expression she'd been watching for 6 weeks, the one that kept stopping just short of the other side of whatever it was, and this time it didn't stop. There's another option, he said. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who has worked something out over a long time and has decided to say it. It would solve the optics, and it would mean the arrangement is what it's supposed to be, legally, rather than... He stopped. I'm not saying it well. She looked at him. I'm asking, he said. I'm doing it badly, but I'm asking. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at Nathan Brooks, at the cramped handwriting man, the broken leg man, the 5 days in a barn man who had crawled back to his own barn because the horse needed feeding, and she thought about the 3 letters worn soft at the folds, and the 43 cents, and the train platform, and the 9 miles in the snow, and everything that had been built since, badly and imperfectly, and out of whatever was on hand. You're asking, she said. Yes. Not because of Casper. He looked at her steadily. Not because of Casper. She set her cup down. Outside, the cattle made their content sound. The fire did what it was supposed to do. All right, she said. He blinked. Something moved across his face that she hadn't seen before. Not surprise exactly, but something that surprise was part of. All right, he repeated. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I told you I'm not a man who says things easily. I know. I want to say... He stopped again. He looked at his hands. You walked 9 miles in a blizzard for a man you'd never met, and then you went to Cheyenne and found a lawyer and a land officer, and came back and ran my ranch for 3 weeks, and you did it all without... He stopped a third time. He looked up. Without making me feel like I owed you anything. I don't know how you did that. She thought about it honestly. I wasn't doing it for you, she said. Not at first. I was doing it because it was the right thing, and because Casper laughed at me on a platform, and I wasn't going home. She paused. The part where it became about you came later. He looked at her. When? He said. When you told me the horse's name, she said. Something shifted in his face then. A slow, imperfect thing. Not a smile exactly, but what a smile comes from. And she looked at it and thought, there it is, the other side of the arithmetic. Outside, the wind came up briefly and dropped again, and the sky through the kitchen window was going the deep orange of late winter afternoon, and the coffee was getting cold, and the situation was what it was, and she was going to deal with it as it came. It was enough. For today, it was more than enough. They were married on a Thursday morning in Dora Finch's store because it was the largest indoor space in Harlow Creek that didn't belong to someone connected to Roy Casper, and because Dora had opinions about where things ought to happen and the energy to enforce them. It was not a large event. The justice of the peace was a man named Hobart Crane, Henry's father, as it turned out, the boy who had run for his mother the day they'd come in from the cold, who arrived with a leather-bound registry and the careful formality of a man taking seriously the one official function his position required. Tom Gale was there. Doc Waverly came, still wearing his coat as if he might need to leave quickly. A woman named Clara Suggs, who ran the laundry on the east end of Front Street and had been one of the people watching when Abigail and Nathan came in from the snow 5 weeks earlier, showed up without being invited and stood near the back with her hands folded and her expression composed into something that was not quite an apology but was adjacent to one. Nathan stood on his crutches. He had refused to sit, which the doc had predicted and accepted with the resignation of a man who knows when a patient has made up his mind. He wore his good coat, which Abigail had brushed clean the night before without commenting on the condition it had been in, and he stood straight and said the words Hobart Crane asked him to say in a voice that was quiet but not uncertain. Abigail wore the better of her two dresses. She had no flowers. She had her mother's thimble in her pocket, which was not traditional but was what she had. And she stood beside a man she had known for 6 weeks and said the words and meant them with the particular quality of meaning that comes not from certainty about the future, but from honesty about the present. Dora had made coffee and a cake that was better than the occasion strictly required, and they ate it at the counter afterward, and Hobart Crane wrote the names in his registry with the deliberate penmanship of a man aware he is making a permanent record, and that was that. Roy Casper heard about it before noon. She knew he would. She had counted on it, which was why the timing had mattered. Thursday, not Saturday, because Saturday gave him the weekend to construct a response. Thursday gave him a fait accompli he had to react to in real time, and men like Casper reacted less carefully than they planned. What he did was appear at the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne on Friday. Holt sent a wire. She was at the ranch when Tom brought it out from town, and she read it standing in the yard with the mud of the early thaw on her boots. Casper in Cheyenne. Attempting to challenge authorization letter. Claims marriage invalidates prior document. Marsh holding. Come if you can. Holt. She read it twice and handed it to Nathan, who had come to the door on his crutches. He read it and his jaw did the thing. The authorization letter was dated before the marriage, she said. He'll argue the marriage changes your legal standing, that a wife can't act as independent agent for her husband's property under territorial law. He said it flat and careful. It's not a strong argument, but it's an argument. Is he right? He's not entirely wrong, Nathan said, which was the most frustrating possible answer, and she could see he knew it. Territorial law it depends on the judge. It depends on who Casper knows. She looked at the wire. Marsh is holding. For now. She went inside and got her coat. She took the Saturday train to Cheyenne, which was the earliest one, and she sent a wire to Holt from the Harlow Creek station before she boarded. Coming Saturday noon. Bring marriage certificate and every document we have. Holt met her at the station. He was wearing his hat and carrying a leather satchel, and he had the look of a man who had not slept enough but was running on the kind of energy that comes from a case he believes in. He told her what had happened while they walked. Casper had appeared at the Territorial Land Office Friday morning with his own lawyer, a man named Delacroix from Laramie, whom Holt described as expensive, well-connected, and wrong more often than he should be given both of those qualities. Delacroix had filed a motion arguing that Abigail's authorization letter, having been granted before her marriage, was now legally ambiguous under territorial property statutes that muddied the waters around a wife's independent agency. He was not arguing it was void. He was arguing it was unclear enough to require a formal hearing before Marsh could proceed. A formal hearing meant delay. Delay meant the Lien proceedings could advance. Advancement meant Casper got what he wanted, not by winning an argument, but by making the argument long enough. "It's the ground shifting," she said. Holt glanced at her. "That's exactly what it is. Nathan said he'd do this. Change what you're standing on instead of coming at you directly. Delacroix is good at this. He does it in land cases across the territory. By the time the hearing happens, the other party is exhausted and out of money, and they settle." He paused. "But he's made a mistake." She looked at him. He filed the motion before he knew about the 1879 survey and what Marsh had already said about the resurvey error. He filed it as if this were a standard lien dispute where the facts were contested. Holt held the satchel tighter. "The facts aren't contested. Nathan's deed is legitimate. The boundary is documented by a survey that predates Casper's claim, and the so-called debt doesn't exist." Delacroix built a procedural argument on top of a substantive case that was already settled. He bought time, but he bought it badly. "What does that mean for Monday?" "Marsh has agreed to hear both sides Monday morning. Not a formal proceeding. He has discretion to convene an informal review at his own office. Delacroix will push for a full hearing with a territorial judge. I'll argue that Marsh has sufficient authority to rule on the counterclaim without escalation, because the documentary evidence is unambiguous." "And the authorization question?" Holt was quiet for a moment. "That's the part I want to talk to you about." They went to his office. He made coffee and he laid out the legal argument carefully, which she had come to appreciate. He never simplified for her, never assumed she'd need the complicated parts explained twice. The authorization question was real but narrow. Under an 1878 territorial statute, a married woman's independent legal actions in property matters were technically subject to her husband's co-authorization unless she had been explicitly granted agency before the marriage. The statute was contested, had been applied inconsistently across 3 territories, and was in the process of being challenged in 2 separate cases. But it existed, and Delacroix knew it existed, and the argument wasn't frivolous enough to dismiss without addressing. "What does Nathan need to do?" she asked. "Sign a new authorization. Dated today, explicitly post-marriage, explicitly granting you independent agency in this matter. It needs to be witnessed and notarized." He paused. "And it needs to arrive here before Monday morning." She thought about the distance between Cheyenne and Harlow Creek. Saturday afternoon. The train ran Sunday. Nathan's handwriting, cramped and slanting. "I'll wire him tonight," she said. "He'll have Tom bring the document on the Sunday train." "Tom Gale will do that?" "Tom Gale would ride to Cheyenne on horseback in February," she said. "He's done more difficult things." Holt almost smiled. "One more thing." She waited. "Marsh asked if you'd be willing to speak on Monday, not as a legal representative, say, as a witness to the events. The fence, the lien timing, the condition in which you found Nathan." He looked at her over his coffee. "He can rule without it, but if you're there and willing to speak, it removes any ambiguity about whether the counterclaim has evidentiary support." She thought about standing in front of Gideon Marsh and saying plainly what had happened in order, the way she said most things. She thought about Roy Casper in the same room, with Delacroix beside him, and his laugh on the platform, and 5 days in a barn. "I'll be there," she said. She sent the wire to Nathan that evening. Tom arrived on the Sunday noon train with a document signed by Nathan Brooks, witnessed by Doc Waverly, and notarized by Hobart Crane, who had, as Tom put it, dressed for it. Tom also brought a letter. Not the cramped functional letters of the last 6 weeks, but something longer, written in the same bad handwriting on 2 pages of brown paper, which meant he hadn't had proper stationery or hadn't wanted to wait to find some. She read it in the boarding house room. She did not read it quickly. He wrote about the ranch. He wrote about the way the thaw was coming in, earlier than last year, the mud at the South Penn gate that needed gravel laid before it got worse. He wrote about Calhoun, who had been restless in a way that probably meant the warmer weather. He wrote these things first, in his way, as if approaching something from the side rather than straight on. Then he wrote, "I have been thinking about what you said, about doing it not for me, about the part where it became about me coming later. I think I understand that. I think I did the same thing, except I didn't know what I was doing until you were already in Cheyenne, and I was in this house that smells like dried herbs now, and I kept looking at the calendar you put up and thinking that someone had paid attention to the details, and that was... I don't have the right word for it. I'm not a man who finds words easily, as you know, but I wanted you to know that the calendar mattered, and the herbs, and the letters, and the 9 miles. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket next to the thimble. Monday morning came in cold and bright, the kind of late winter day that makes promises it may or may not keep. She walked to the Territorial Land Office at 8:45, and Holt met her at the door and they went in together. Marsh's office was larger than it looked from the street. There was a long table, chairs on both sides. Casper was already there with Delacroix. Casper in a wool suit that cost more than most men in Harlow Creek made in a month. Delacroix with the particular proprietary calm of a lawyer who has run this play before. They looked up when she came in. Casper's expression did the thing she'd watched it do on the ranch. Assessment, calculation, the filing away of information. Then it settled. Marsh came in at 9 exactly and sat at the head of the table and put on his glasses and opened a folder and said, "This is an informal review of a counterclaim to a lien filing. I want to be clear about what this is and what it isn't. It isn't a trial. I'm not a judge. What I am is the person responsible for the accuracy of the territorial land record, and what I have before me is a conflict between 2 sets of documents that cannot both be correct." He looked at both sides of the table. "Mr. Delacroix, you filed a procedural motion Friday. I've read it. I'll hear your argument first." Delacroix spoke for 20 minutes. He was good, precise, organized. His argument about the authorization statute laid out with the structure of someone who had built it carefully and knew where each piece went. He acknowledged the 1879 survey, but argued its provenance needed verification from the original surveying firm before it could be considered definitive. He acknowledged the lien's timing, but argued that the timing was coincidental to Nathan's accident rather than connected to it. He was smooth in the way that things are smooth when they've been practiced, and she sat across the table and listened to every word and noted where the seams were. Holt spoke for 15 minutes. He was shorter and more specific. He put the 1879 survey on the table and walked through it date by date, name by name, measurement by measurement. He put the lien notice on the table and put Nathan's authorization letter beside it, both the original and the new one, dated Sunday, notarized by Hobart Crane. He noted that the resurvey error of 1883 had been internally flagged by the Territorial Land Office at the time of filing and had never been corrected in the public record. He said, "The counterclaim is not procedurally ambiguous. The documents are clear. The boundary is where the 1879 survey says it is, and the land Casper's lien describes is Nathan Brooks's land, and the debt the lien claims does not exist." Then Marsh looked at Abigail and said, "Mrs. Brooks, Mr. Holt tells me you were present at the property in question during the relevant period. Would you be willing to describe what you found?" She looked at Marsh. She did not look at Casper. She said, "She had arrived in Harlow Creek on a Tuesday in February. The man who had sent for her was missing. She had been told he was probably dead and advised to take the next train east. She had instead gone out 9 miles northeast on snowshoes in winter conditions to the Brooks Ranch, where she had found Nathan Brooks in a barn loft with a broken leg, alive, having been there for 5 days. On her return to Harlow Creek, she had found a lien notice at the ranch house that had been filed 4 days prior, while Nathan was missing and unable to respond. She had gone to Cheyenne with the property documents and filed a counterclaim. These were the events in order. She said them plainly. She did not editorialize. She did not say what she thought Casper had intended. She stated facts and let the sequence speak for itself, because a sequence of facts arranged correctly is its own argument, and it does not need help. The room was quiet when she finished. Delacroix said, "Mrs. Brooks, you have no legal training. How did you know the lien filing was fraudulent rather than a legitimate debt claim?" She looked at him. "Nathan told me he had no debt to Roy Casper. I read the deed and the survey documents, and I could see that the land described in the lien was Nathan's property. I found a lawyer who confirmed it." She paused. "You don't need legal training to read a date on a document." Marsh looked at Casper. "Mr. Casper, The debt you've claimed as the basis for the lien. Do you have documentation of the debt? A pause, short but present. Delacroix said, Mr. Casper's financial records are a private matter that would be subject to subpoena in a formal proceeding. This is my office, and I asked Mr. Casper a question, Marsh said without heat. Casper looked at Marsh. He looked at the table. The debt is documented in my private accounts, he said. I'm prepared to produce records in a proper legal setting. The lien was filed without contemporaneous documentation, Marsh said. He was reading from his folder now, not looking at either of them. Standard procedure requires at minimum a written record of the debt instrument. Your filing listed the debt as an oral agreement. He turned a page. An oral agreement for how much and under what terms? Another pause. Longer. Delacroix leaned toward Casper and said something inaudible. $1,200, Casper said, for equipment and labor provided to the Brooks property in 1881. Marsh looked at him over his glasses. Mr. Brooks's deed records show he took sole possession of the property in March 1879 and has since operated it independently. Do you have labor or equipment records from 1881? Casper's jaw set. Delacroix said, As I stated, the records are in a proper legal setting, Marsh said. Yes, I heard you. He closed the folder, he folded his hands on top of it, and the room was very quiet. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do, Marsh said. I'm going to record the 1879 Laramie Survey as the definitive boundary document for the Brooks Ranch Northeast parcel in the territorial record. I'm going to note the 1883 resurvey error formally and flag the public record accordingly. I'm going to refer the lien filing to the Territorial Attorney's Office for review on the grounds that the claimed debt lacks contemporaneous documentation and the lien was filed during a period when the property owner was incapacitated and unable to respond. He looked at Casper directly for the first time. That referral does not prejudge the outcome. What it does is ensure that the filing receives scrutiny proportionate to the circumstances. Delacroix said, We'd like the opportunity to review. You'll have it, Marsh said, through the attorney's office. That process takes time, and I understand that's inconvenient. The counterclaim, however, I'm ruling on today. He looked at both sides of the table. The counterclaim is upheld. The lien is suspended pending the attorney's review. The Brooks Ranch Northeast parcel boundary stands as documented in the 1879 survey. He stood. This review is concluded. She sat for a moment after Marsh left the room. She heard Casper push back his chair. She heard Delacroix say something low and quick. She heard their footsteps and the door. Then she heard nothing for a moment except the sound of Holt organizing his papers, which was a brisk and satisfied sound. He referred it to the attorney's office, she said, which means an investigation. Holt was already putting things back in the satchel. Casper's lawyers will slow it down, but it's on record now. The timing, the missing documentation, the fact that the debt can't be substantiated. He snapped the satchel shut. He won't pursue the land again, not this land. The risk is too high now that there's a formal record. She thought about that. He walks away. From this, Holt looked at her. Men like Casper don't stop. They find another angle, another property, another situation, but not this one. You've made this one too expensive. She nodded slowly. You did well in there, Holt said. The sequence of facts. That was the right call. Nathan taught me that, she said. Indirectly. She took the afternoon train back to Harlow Creek. The landscape out the window was changing, not dramatically. Wyoming in March doesn't make dramatic changes. But there were brown patches showing through the snow where the ground had come back to the surface. And the light was different, longer at the edges, and the sky was the kind of blue that belonged to a season other than the one she'd arrived in. She thought about what Holt had said. Men like Casper don't stop. She thought about that, and she thought it was probably true. And she thought about the fact that what you could do about men like that was not make them stop. You couldn't do that, she understood, not permanently, not the way you can solve an arithmetic problem and have it stay solved. What you could do was make the ground they wanted too costly to stand on. You could document and file and show up in rooms where they expected to be the only person with a case, and you could be correct about the facts, and you could keep being there. That was not a satisfying resolution in the way that stories are supposed to be satisfying. It was a real one. Nathan was at the door when the wagon came up the ranch road. He was on his crutches still. The doc had said another 3 weeks before he tried to carry weight without them. And he stood in the doorway with the early evening light behind him and watched her come. She got down from the wagon, and Tom took it to the barn, and she walked to the door, and Nathan looked at her. "Well?" he said. Marsh upheld the counterclaim. The lien is suspended. The 1879 survey is now on record as definitive. She came through the door. He referred the filing to the territorial attorney's office. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He moved back from the doorway, carefully, and she followed him in, and he sat at the table, and she sat across from him, and the kitchen was warm, and it smelled like the herbs on the windowsill. "The attorney's office," he said. "That's an investigation." "Yes." "Casper will have lawyers on it by tomorrow." "He already does." She looked at the table. "It won't go to trial. Holt thinks he'll let it drag until it's quietly dropped. But the record exists now, and the boundary is settled." She looked up. "He's not coming for the north pasture again." Nathan's hands were on the table, flat, the way they got when he was processing something without showing it. He looked at them. Then he looked at her. "You went twice," he said. "2 trains, 2 sets of meetings, a room full of lawyers. It needed doing." "Abigail." She waited. "I got your letter," he said. "About Marsh, about what Delacroix tried." He was quiet for a moment. "I was sitting in this kitchen reading it, and I kept thinking—" He stopped, started again. "I kept thinking about what it cost you. Not money, just the cost of it. Doing all of that for a piece of land that isn't even yours." "It's mine now," she said. "We're married." "You know what I mean." "I do." She looked at him directly. "And I know what you're trying to say, and I'm going to tell you that you don't owe me anything for it. That's not how it works between us. If it worked that way, it would be wrong." He looked at her. "I did it because it needed doing, and I could do it," she said. "Same reason you fed the horse." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically. Nathan Brooks didn't do things dramatically. But it broke open, and she saw it, and he let her see it, which was its own kind of statement from a man who kept most things to himself. "The horse needed feeding," he said. "Yes," she said. "It did. The fire did what it was supposed to do." Outside, Calhoun moved in the barn, the particular shift and exhale of an animal settling for the night. Somewhere south, Harlow Creek was sitting with what it knew, which was more than it had known in February and less than it would know later. Spring came the way springs come in Wyoming, grudgingly, with setbacks, 2 steps toward warmth and 1 back into cold. The mud at the South Penn gate getting worse before Abigail finally got the gravel laid with Tom's help on a Tuesday in April. Nathan came off the crutches in late March and spent 2 weeks learning to trust the leg again, which was its own process, frustrating and incremental and not something anyone could do for him. She watched him do it without offering help he hadn't asked for, and she understood that this was one of the things she had learned in these weeks: how to be present without presuming, how to let a person carry their own weight and be nearby when they needed to put some of it down. He started riding again in April. The first time out, he came back after 2 hours and said only that the north fence line was intact and the cattle were grazing the south pasture and the ground was looking right for spring. She understood that it was more than that. He had gone to look at his land the way you look at something after someone has tried to take it, wanting to confirm it is still there, still itself, still yours. It was. Dora Finch came out to the ranch in May, which she had not done in the 4 years Nathan had been its sole occupant, and she sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and looked around at the dried herbs and the current calendar and the second chair that had been pulled to a more useful angle. And she didn't comment on any of it except to say that the coffee was better than it used to be, which everyone understood to mean something broader. Tom Gale came for supper on a Friday in June and stayed 2 hours past when he'd said he would, which was not something Tom Gale did, and she took it to mean that the thing being built at the Brooks Ranch was something he wanted to be near, which was also something broader. Clara Suggs stopped her on Front Street in July and said, in the particular oblique way of someone who is doing a thing they've been working up to for a while, "I heard what you did. about the legal business, about going to Cheyenne. She stopped. She looked at the street. I should have been kinder in February, when you came in. Abigail looked at her. It was February, she said. People aren't always their best selves in February. Clara looked at her sideways. You were. I was just cold and too stubborn to go home, she said, which was not entirely true and not entirely false, and was good enough. She thought about Roy Casper sometimes. Not often. He was still in Harlow Creek, still the same man with the same money and the same easy smile, deployed in the same rooms. He did not look at her the way he had looked at her on the platform. He did not look at her much at all, which was its own kind of statement about what the spring had settled. The investigation from the Territorial Attorney's Office proceeded at the pace Holt had predicted. Slow, lawyered, unlikely to arrive at anything dramatic. But it was there, on record. And men who live by the management of appearances understand what it means to have something on record. One evening in August, Nathan came in from the South Pen and sat at the table, and she poured coffee and sat across from him. And it was so like the first evening, the table, the fire, the light going orange through the kitchen window, that she thought about it, about how far the distance was between that evening and this one. Not in miles or months exactly, but in the particular accumulation of ordinary things. The letters, the gravel at the South Pen gate, the Sunday when he'd first ridden out on Calhoun and come back to tell her about the north fence, the 100 small calibrations of two people learning how to share a life without making it smaller. She had not become someone different. That was the thing she had thought about on the train back from Cheyenne, sitting in the same seat she'd sat in going south, watching the same landscape run past in the other direction. She had thought, I have not changed who I am. Roy Casper had laughed at her on a platform and expected that laugh to define the next chapter of her story, and she had understood, somewhere around the 4th mile marker on the way to Nathan's barn, that she would not allow that. Not because she was invincible, not because the world had turned out to be kinder than it looked, but because what a person does when things are terrible is the truest information available about who they are. And she had decided, by the second storm, what information she was going to offer. The frontier had taken things from her. It was not sentimental about people, and it did not hand out second chances as a policy. It had taken her warmth and her certainty and her dignity on a train platform, and 5 nights' sleep, and the full use of her feet, which still ached in the cold in ways the doc said would probably always be there. These were real losses. She held them as real losses, not as lessons, not as the price of something, just as things that had been taken. But she was here. She was at this table, in this kitchen, on this land. She had made those 9 miles twice. She had sat across from a territorial land officer and said the facts plainly and let them speak. She had written 4 pages to a man who needed to know his land was being observed and then crossed out the personal parts, and then written them back in, because the truth was the only thing she had that nobody could file a lien on. Nathan looked at her across the table. He had the letter she'd written from Cheyenne in the kitchen drawer. She knew because she'd seen it there, folded differently than she'd sent it, which meant he'd read it more than once. He had not mentioned this. He was not a man who mentioned things like that. But she knew. What are you thinking about? He said. She thought about the thimble in her pocket, the one she'd carried from Ohio. She thought about her mother's hands, capable and unhurried, and what her mother had told her once about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that just shows up the next day and does the work. February, she said. He looked at her steadily. I was thinking that I came here with 43 cents, she said, and that Roy Casper laughed at me, and then he spent the better part of 6 months trying to remove me from a situation he had already decided wasn't mine to be in. She turned her cup. And I was thinking that none of his calculations included the possibility that I would just stay. Nathan was quiet. That's all it was, she said. In the end, I just stayed. He looked at her with the expression she knew by now, the one that had taken 6 weeks to arrive at its other side and had been there ever since, reliable and unguarded in the particular way of things that have stopped being defended. That's not all it was, he said. No, she said, but it's where it started. Outside, the sky was doing what Wyoming skies do in August, going colors that have no names in the standard vocabulary, the land and the air and the last light, making something that was too large to describe and that most people were too tired to look at by the time it happened, because the day had been long and the work had been real and there was more of both tomorrow. She looked at it anyway. She had learned to look at it. That was one of the things the winter had given her, in the particular algebra of what gets taken and what gets left. She had learned that the large and unnameable things were worth stopping for. Not because they solved anything, but because a person who stops for them is different from a person who doesn't, in ways that matter when the next February comes. And it would come. She knew that. The next difficulty, the next Casper, the next 9 miles in the wrong kind of weather. The world was not reformed by one woman's refusal to go home. It kept being itself, indifferent and enormous, and not especially concerned with fairness. But she would still be here. She had 43 cents and she had stayed, and she had built something out of that, badly and imperfectly, and with gravel from Dora's supply and brown wrapping paper and a compass and the horse's name, and it was real, and it was hers, and it was enough. It was, she thought, looking at the sky above the land that the 1879 survey said was theirs, considerably more than enough.